Hello, my name's Amy Travis. I'm a family therapist at the Morton Center, and today we're going to be talking about boundaries. Boundaries are so important for families and for individuals who are struggling with substance use. Boundaries are just important in human relations in general. So let's look first at what is a boundary. So if you think of a boundary as a type of emotional or psychological or physical barrier between one person and another, or maybe between one person and multiple people. This barrier helps to establish guidelines for how you're going to communicate with each other. What kind of behavior is considered acceptable? What are your responsibilities within the relationship? What kind of accountability is going to be present within the relationship? Boundaries are very important for helping to establish a sense of safety. Um, if I know that, if I know what the boundaries are in a relationship, and if they're reliable and predictable, then I know what to expect. I know that I can trust. I can trust kind of the parameters of the world of that relationship. So I like to think of boundaries as kind of existing on a spectrum. Um, and this image that I'm going to give can be helpful in understanding a healthy versus an unhealthy boundary. Healthy boundaries help to do everything that we just said. It helps to make sure that relationships are safe and supportive and respectful and reciprocal. That there is a sense of a space where trust can be built. Unhealthy boundaries tend to be very rigid. They tend to be used, whether intentionally or unintentionally, as ways to control certain aspects of the relationship, or maybe keep people away, like block people out. So I'm gonna come back to this idea of a spectrum. If you think on one end of the spectrum might be a boundary that's like a steel wall. It's solid and rigid and unyielding. There's no door. It's just absolutely um, impenetrable. It's completely rigid. On the other end might be something um, like cheesecloth, where it's like there's a structure there, but it's there's free flow of information from one side to the other. Of course, all the way to the other extreme might be no boundary at all. And so a healthy boundary is going to be somewhere in the middle, where there is that free flow of communication and energy, but also there's a sense of if I need to strengthen the boundary for some reason, have the right to do that, and that boundary is going to be respected by other people. And then if I need to um, uh, have that boundary be more flexible, that will also be respected. So an unhealthy boundary might be, well, that steel wall might be a healthy boundary if it's providing some sense of safety between me and another person who is toxic to me. That same steel wall may become an unhealthy boundary if it is serving as a source of emotional cutoff. Like I've put it up between me and maybe a relationship that needs healing. Maybe it's important for my healing to be able to interact with that person, but that boundary is so rigid that I've kind of isolated myself away from the people who I need to talk to, or who I need to seek support from. So then it would be the same type of boundary would be unhealthy. So it's important to kind of figure out, what are the boundaries in my life, and am I utilizing them in ways that are healthy, or do they isolate me from others in unhealthy ways? So here's some signs in relationships that a boundary is needed. Um, Excessive criticism. Uh, Often that criticism will take the form of shaming language. And so shame, because the next thing on here is a guilt trip, which guilt and shame, it's important to understand the difference between those two. Guilt is really about something that I have done, and shame is about who I am. So maybe I am guilty of telling a lie, but shame is going to be telling me that not only have I told a lie, but I am a liar fundamentally. And there's nothing that can shift that. And that is always who I'll be. So shaming language is a good indication that there's emotional toxicity happening and that a boundary is needed. Lecturing and advising, attempts to fix or control is a sign. That feeling of walking on eggshells, the feeling that no matter what I do, no matter what I say, I'm going to walk into some kind of, landmine. I'm going to walk into some kind of just emotional explosion, and I can never really know. I'm never on solid ground with this person. That can lead to being taken advantage of or being manipulated. Rehashing the past. So there are many times where looking back at the past to try to get clarity, try to get insight, try to get some kind of resolution around past difficulties. There are times when that's very important. That's very different from just continuing to go to the past and use it to bash another person or to kind of keep them feeling that sense of shame or to feel like you're controlling them. And so all of this, everything on this list, can bring about chronic stress. And so if there's a sense that chronic stress is there, and along with it is like chronic anxiety, suspicion and doubt, maybe even feeling almost like there's become a sense of paranoia around the safety of the relationship. All of these things point to needing a boundary or multiple boundaries. Boundaries do a lot for us. They limit behavior, and with that very first point, it's important to point out that a boundary can only be set on yourself. You can't set a boundary on another person because you can't control another person. You really can't make a person do something. The boundary is really about your own behavior or how you're going to respond to somebody else's behavior. So it gives those kind of ground rules for how you're going to act in a relationship. Again, it provides a sense of safety. It helps to protect from threats when they are occurring or about to occur. It gives a space for healthier interaction, healthier communication. These next 2 points really go together. Boundaries are really about values. So often with boundary work, if you can clarify your value first, it makes setting the boundary and sticking to it a lot easier. So for example, if I have a loved one who is being disrespectful to me, it may be difficult to set a boundary with them because of the relationship that's there, the love that's there, and because boundary setting can feel very risky. If I set a boundary with this person, what if they leave the relationship? If I look at it from a little bit of a different angle, and I discover that I have a deep value of respect, I have a deep value of being treated as an equal. Well, if I'm going to live into that value, if that's going to really become, how I live my life, all of a sudden setting that boundary may become easier because whether you're related to me or not, or you're a loved one or not, if that goes against my value, then it may be easier to, or more clear what boundary needs to be set. Boundaries can increase a sense of safety to express your emotions and thoughts, and express what those values are. Takes away the need, or helps to take away the need to attempt to control another. Remember, you can't control another person. Sometimes we get stuck in this idea that we can, and so boundaries help to interrupt that cycle. They also help to interrupt the orbiting cycle, and that's a really important dynamic to be aware of in family systems or friend systems where there's somebody struggling with substance use. So if you think for a moment about a planet orbiting around, there's if you think of the solar system and the sun in the middle and the planets are orbiting around, they are pulled into the gravitational pull of the sun. So if you think about that in terms of substance use, the substance is in the middle. And the person who is struggling with that is orbiting around the substance. They've literally kind of become pulled into that gravitational pull of the substance. Now, what happens with family is family often, if you imagine the substance and one person circling around it, well, then family, however many people that is often then circling around the person, circling around the substance. And so everybody's like pulled into and consumed by this one substance. And so boundaries can really help to interrupt that cycle as well. They can help family and friends step aside and not get sucked into that orbiting cycle. So boundaries can also help put responsibility in the right place, responsibility for actions, and they can be an accountability exercise. Another kind of dynamic that boundaries can help to interrupt is the parent-child dynamic. So if you think about in relationships, adult relationships, whether it's parent and adult child, partner or spouse, friends, siblings, if you have two adults who are chronologically grown-ups and should be functioning at a relatively equal level with each other. Often what happens in substance use is because of people's behavior, one person slips into this child role and the other person slips into the parent role. The person in the child role is making all kinds of bad decisions, and the person in the parent role is fixing it, cleaning up after them. And it's very easy to get stuck in those two places. So boundary setting can help begin to bring back a sense of balance into relationships so that, there can be help given and help received, but in a way that's reciprocal, in a way that both people stay in kind of their grown-up selves and promotes a sense of balance within the relationship. Boundaries can also free up energy for self-care and developing your own life and relationships, which is so important. In working with families, there's a lot of emphasis on their own self-care because so often that energy goes into the other person, caring for the other person, trying to save or rescue that person. It comes from a place of love or concern or fear for that person's health and well-being. So part of the healing process for families and part of the reasons for boundaries is it gets your energy back to you so that you can take care of yourself. And a huge reason is when boundaries, healthy boundaries are in place, it can interrupt abusive behavior before it starts, or if it has started, it can, put a very firm boundary there so that it won't continue. So to come back to the earlier point about values, it's important to take the time. This also comes back to that idea of self-care. Take the time to really define for yourself, what do you stand for? What do you believe in? What are your values? Literally make yourself a list of the top 10 values that guide your life. That will really help in boundary setting. And to know fundamentally that you have the right to say no. You have the right to claim for yourself, I want to live in a substance-free home. I believe that I deserve to be treated with respect. So that's some really important work in getting ready to set a boundary. And this last point, no is a complete sentence. Very often when trying to set a boundary, it's easy to get stuck feeling like you have to explain it or validate it, or that the other person has to be completely on board with your boundary in order for you to uphold it. It's really important to know no is enough. No is a complete sentence. You can state what your value is, and that's valid. So if I believe that I deserve to be treated with respect, that in and of itself is enough. I can put a period right at the end of that sentence, and I don't have to give further explanation in order for it to be a valid value. So boundaries, it's important that they are communicated. Now they don't have to be, the other person doesn't have to agree with my reasoning, like I was just saying, but I do need to state what my boundary is. Very often you come up with the boundary, but then think that it's obvious or expect the other person to know what it is or guess what it is. It's not going to be effective if it's not stated out loud. Also, it's important for them to be predictable or reliable. So it doesn't work very well to have to state a boundary at one point and then, an hour later change that. Now, it's okay to change your boundaries if you assess, okay, that boundary didn't work very well, I need to set a different one. But that also needs to be communicated. And sometimes where boundary setting falls down is we'll express a boundary, something about it won't work. Maybe it was too big or the consequence was not something that we could uphold. So something about it doesn't work right. So then we change something in our thinking, but then don't come back and say, okay, that one didn't work. This is now what I'm going to set as my boundary. So it needs to be reliable, it needs to be communicated. And when you're thinking of communication, do some work on your own communication and figuring out, if you have any tendency towards passive aggressive communication, of course, towards passive or aggressive communication as well. The most effective type of communication is assertive. And so, do some research and do some learning about these different communication styles and really try to aim towards assertive, direct, clear communication of the boundaries that you have set for yourself. So here's a boundary setting exercise. I provided the link here. It's from Mar Treatment Center, and it's a really good boundary setting exercise because it gets to that value place. It incorporates the boundary and the consequence and the values and the emotions, because all of those it's all kind of intertwined. So there's 3 steps to it, and I recommend for people to actually write this out, especially in the beginning of learning how to set boundaries. Actually write it out so that you will have like a script for yourself. Not that you'll necessarily read it to the person, although that may be very helpful, but it gives you a chance to speak it out loud, maybe to a support person, or even just to yourself. There's a lot of power in that. Sometimes just hearing our words helps to clarify things. So you might go through this exercise and get it all worked out, and then read it out loud and go, wait a second, I there's something about this that doesn't feel right, or I didn't articulate it the way I want it to be. So the more you work with it, the easier it will become, and you'll get to a point where you kind of memorize these steps, and then you don't need to write it out as much. But that initial work is very valuable. So it's got these 3 steps. When you blank, whatever the behavior is, I feel this because, and that's where the value comes in. So for example, um, when you lie to me, I feel sad because I feel disrespected. So right there, I'm like going below the surface. It's also keeping it on me and my feelings, and it's going to keep it on my behavior, as opposed to pointing the finger and blaming and shaming, which usually raises the defenses on the other side. So once those defenses are raised, it's going to be harder to have a productive conversation. So in this case, it is addressing the behavior, but it's bringing it right back to me and what's going on with me around it. So instead of this is what I prefer. I prefer for you to be honest with me, because then I feel like I'm respected in the relationship, and that we can build trust together. And then the third part, this is sometimes the hardest part. If you blank, so it goes back to that beginning behavior. So if you continue to lie, I will blank. There's the consequence. And the consequence has to be something that you will uphold. So sometimes consequences, we set them too big. So, if you continue to lie, I will never speak to you ever again in my whole life. Well, if this is with somebody that I love and want a relationship with, I probably am not going to be able to stick to that consequence. And I know that, and they know that. So as soon as I speak to them, I've just stepped over my own boundary and have set up the atmosphere of distrust on my end, because now I'm telling them you can't trust what I say either, because I'm going to threaten something and then not stick to it. So you have to really think about what that appropriate consequence would be, what you're actually going to stick to. So if you continue to lie to me, maybe I will not feel like I can share my emotions with you. Maybe I will need to have this conversation instead of just you and me. We'll need to get some help with this, because if you continue to lie, then I won't feel safe in this conversation. I'll need some outside help with this. So the consequence would be we'll need to go to family therapy at that point, because I don't feel safe having the conversation just you and me. Now, That's a consequence that I could stick to, because I'll go to family therapy and we can talk there. So that's a really important work, is this look at consequences. In the same way that boundaries have to be communicated, consequences have to be communicated as well. It has to be something that you can follow through. And you have to look at, this point about the risk behind it. Boundary setting and consequences can feel very emotionally risky. Think back to my first consequence that I stated. If you continue to lie, I will never speak to you again, ever, ever, ever. Well, if that's true, and I'm going to really stick to that, then that means absolute emotional cutoff. That goes back to that steel wall boundary. That means that that steel wall comes down and the relationship is essentially over. Now, maybe that's where we are. Maybe it's time for that steel wall. But if you're not ready for that, then really evaluating, what is the risk here? Is the risk that there's going to be an end to the relationship? Is there going to be potentially an argument? Will my feelings be impacted? So just doing some evaluation around that and getting support for yourself. It can be very helpful to have to kind of bookend. So let's say you've done all the work around developing your boundary and figuring out what the consequences, and you're ready to say it to your loved one, making sure that you have support ahead and afterwards. Ahead of time can help you kind of, you might need to practice the boundary that you're setting, but also kind of recommitting to your values and to yourself in that process. And then you go and you have the conversation and you say what you have worked up as your boundary and consequence. And then afterwards, you have support to help process through what worked and what didn't work. Okay, we had the conversation. This is what I said. This is where I felt like I stayed on track. And then this is where I felt like, maybe I backtracked, or maybe I got overwhelmed, or all of my emotions came up and I got confused. And so then you can process that. And then as you go forward to the next time that you need to set a boundary, you'll have all of that good thinking in place. And the next time will hopefully be a little bit easier. So I hope that all of this information has been helpful. Boundary setting can be a overwhelming task to work on, especially in the beginning, but it can be very valuable and bring a lot of healing into relationships. So to me, there's a lot of, it's work, but there's a lot of hope in this work, to be able to bring structure and predictability and accountability into a relationship. So I hope this has been helpful. If you'd like more resources from the Morton Center, we have a concerned persons group that meets every Tuesday at 5:30. We look at topics like boundary setting and enabling, and how to bring healthier communication into relationships. If you'd like to reach out to me, my email is atravis@themortoncenter.org. So again, that's atravis@themortoncenter.org. And thank you for listening.